hand and talk to her. Don't, don't stand on formality. Did I missed anything?
I think you got it.
She's going to talk for the first half of class. We will take a break. I'm going to talk for a while, and if I can behave myself, we will have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end to talk about the upcoming assignment, the deliberative accommodation, and the assignment sheet. Go over that. That is what I'm going to be talking about, but if I can shut myself off, we'll have some time to talk
I'll
about.
take care of that.
Okay, Kate will throw something out.
I'll keep the stopwatch going.
She's going to say, sit down and shut up.
Yeah.
Okay, without further ado.
Thank you.
Next.
Good evening. It's a nice, cool evening, and I'm really happy to be here to talk to you all about an education campaign that has been really a primary focus for me for the last 5 years. And I'm hoping that some of what we learned through this campaign may be helpful to you, because I understand you all are doing projects related to microplastics awareness, right? So that's good. That's an emerging topic that is a concern for us at the Estuary Program, and we are partners in that project with the University of Florida. So really looking forward to having your help and your good ideas to help move that project along. The Tampa Bay Estuary Program. Has anybody ever heard of the Tampa Bay Estuary Program? Good, great. 2 people, yay. Anybody tell me what an estuary is? Perfect. Who said that?
Andy.
Great, yes. It's just where fresh water and salt water meet. So Tampa Bay is a mixture of fresh water from places like the Hillsborough River, right? And salt water from the Gulf of Mexico. And I do educational programming for the Estuary Program. I've worked there for about 18 years. And so it's my job to try to convey to different audiences why the Bay is valuable to us and how they can help protect it. The Bee Floridian campaign is a fertilizer education campaign that we started about 5 years ago. And you're going to see in a minute why there's plastic pink flamingos walking through the Hillsborough River in downtown Tampa. So tonight what I'm going to touch on is social marketing, because this is the particular technique that we use to develop this program. And how did we use this for the Bee Floridian campaign? What did we learn from that? And maybe how you might be able to take some of what we learned, both what worked and what didn't, and put those lessons to use in your own projects for the microplastics awareness. Whoops, I'm stuck. Okay. All right, so what is social marketing? Does anyone in here in marketing or education? All right, but you're all learning about sustainability, and a key to success with that is being able to communicate what sustainability is and what practices promote sustainability, right? That's education. So whether you know it or not, you're going to be educators and communicators. Social marketing is a particular type of education that focuses on changing behavior. So it's kind of the difference between knowledge and action. Knowing about something, being an expert in something, and simply making a change that leads to contributed knowledge or to improvement in an area. So social marketing draws on social psychology, the successful techniques that advertisers use to get into our minds and tell us why we want to buy certain things, why we want to dress certain ways, why we want to drive certain cars. Uses a lot of those techniques, what we know about the way our minds work, and uses them for the greater good, for education. And in your case, for concepts related to sustainability. It works at the community level, and it's science-based. It follows a methodical process. The process generally includes these components. First of all, determining what behavior you want to target and what your audience is. Those are really, really essential. Identifying why people don't want to do what you're trying to convince them they should do, or why they might want to do that. So the benefits and barriers. And then developing and testing your strategy or your messaging, implementing your program, evaluating it, because increasingly, whether you work in the public or the private sector, you're going to want to know that the money that you're spending is bringing something back, is reaping a dividend. And it's no different from me working for government. We really have to justify that what we're doing is making a difference. So evaluation is a very important part of this. And then adjusting your campaign or your message as you learn and as you evaluate and you see what's working and what isn't. So I just want to preface by saying social marketing is not social media, although social media can and often is an important component of social marketing. Social media is a tool for delivering your message, but social marketing is a process by which you determine what your message is going to be, who you're going to deliver it to, and how you're going to deliver it most effectively. Social media can be an important component, as I said, and this chart shows that, basically 60% of all adults in this country are doing some sort of social networking. This is actually a 2010 figure, so it's probably higher now. And I don't need to tell you guys that because you're all connected. All right, social psychology. I put this in, I'm an old fart. My husband is an older fart. And Chevrolet has convinced middle-aged males and older that this is the car of their dreams. So every time my husband sees a Corvette, he reacts. And he goes, there's my car. So how did they do that? How did they do that? What do you think this Corvette says to a middle-aged guy?
You want me to really tell you?
Yes, I do. Yes, because this is what advertisers do. They get in meetings and they discuss this.
It's like a measure of power. It's kind of like, in a way, it's kind of a phallic symbol. Like,
It is.
maybe I have
It
to
is.
plan this, but I have this big car.
Exactly. Yep. Maybe you can attract young women. Yeah. My husband used to talk about, we've been together for quite a while, but he used to talk about replacing me with, initially it was like two 22-year-olds, and then it was two 23-year-olds. Now it's like two 28-year-olds, but you get the idea. This is, I'm like, honey, if you can get them, go for it. But this is social psychology. I mean, think about how advertisers have convinced you that Apple laptop is the computer that you have to have, right? Or that we have to wear a certain brand of clothes, or we have to live in a certain community. It's really all about what's going on in our minds, and you can take the same knowledge of social behavior and psychology and apply that to educational messaging. All right, a really good example of social marketing that is one that you might see now relates to teen smoking. So smoking in general has declined dramatically, hasn't it? It has in my lifetime dramatically. And smoking among teens has really declined. The key is intercepting teens before they start smoking, because once you have that habit, it's very difficult to break, isn't it? So there's been a huge campaign to try and prevent teens from smoking to begin with. And initially, it started out with this kind of an offer. Hey, Junior, if you don't smoke, you can live to be old, just like us. Well, that's a message that a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old is really going to respond to, isn't it? Probably not. But so if you twist that around and you actually do some marketing, you do some research, and you do some test messaging, you come up with something like this, which does reach a younger audience. This is the, I'm going to see if I can use the pointer. Oh, look, it works. This is the Truth Campaign. Are any of you familiar with that? All right. Our campaign, Be Floridian, was developed by me working with, and they get most of the credit, a company called Salter Mitchell. The principal of that, Peter Mitchell, is a brain child behind the Truth Campaign. So he definitely knows about social marketing. I've been really, really fortunate to work with him. But this strikes on something that teens would respond to, right? Rebelling against adults. So this is a rebellious ad, but it has this wonderful little tagline, truth, that has been carried through the entire campaign. Commercials I've seen lately, some of them are just really, really direct, graphic, in your face. You've seen people who are on ventilators and speaking through a throat tube, those commercials, that's the same campaign. Tried all sorts of different things, and a lot of the ads for the Truth Campaign were actually developed by young people, which is kind of cool. So they went out and said, if we're going to try to reach young people, let's have them come in and help us develop these messages. Okay, my case study, what I've been working on, is probably not nearly as exciting as Corvettes or, old people wearing bikinis in a Truth Campaign. My issue is reducing lawn fertilizer use. And this is because, I hope I have an explainer. I do, yes. This is because 20% of the pollution coming into Tampa Bay, nitrogen is our major pollutant, major source of pollution. And it's an essential nutrient that makes plants grow, right? Farmers use nitrogen. If you have a house with turf grass, you might use nitrogen. Using too much can cause algae to grow in Tampa Bay. And algae blooms are not good for the bay. So we really have been making an effort to try and get people to reduce their fertilizer use. And particularly in the summer, because we get about half of all our yearly rainfall in the summertime. If you know that because you live in Florida. June through September, we get, most of our rain. Remember last August? So imagine if you had just fertilized your yard in the first week of August, and then we had record flooding right after that. What happened to that fertilizer? Exactly. It washed off directly into the bay. So it is a problem that we can do something about. We've done a great job of addressing other sources of pollution in the bay, particularly those that are called point sources that come from pipes, like wastewater and industrial discharges. Those are no longer the major source of pollution. But this bigger issue of stormwater, which you may deal with in your jobs now or your future jobs with sustainability, this bigger issue of runoff off the land is one that's really difficult to address and one that we're working really hard on. It requires everybody to participate because it doesn't come from a single pipe that we can go and retrofit or remove. It's coming from everywhere. Our yards, our parking lots, office parks, university campuses, everywhere. So we were asked by our local government partners, and those are Hillsborough, Manatee, and Pinellas counties, and now Pasco, they just joined our membership, and the cities of Tampa, St. Pete, and Clearwater to develop a model ordinance to restrict fertilizer use in the summertime in this area, because we knew that that is the greatest risk in the summer of lawn fertilizer washing off into the bay. And from that, the model ordinance, our various local government partners enacted their own ordinances within their counties. Two of them, Pinellas County and Tampa, have the strongest fertilizer ordinances in the nation, by far. They are real leaders in this effort. They actually not only restrict the use of lawn fertilizer, nitrogen, but it cannot even be sold during those summer months. So if you go to a Home Depot in the city of Tampa, my Home Depot, our Home Depot on Florida Avenue, Seminole Heights, you're not going to find a nitrogen fertilizer there in the summertime, unless it's labeled strictly for vegetables. But you're generally not going to find a fertilizer there. Lots of other communities restrict the use of the fertilizer, but not the sales. And these ordinances apply across the board to people who are maintaining lawns, to homeowners, and to the stores, like I said, including Walmart and Home Depot in the cities of Tampa and St. Pete. So after these ordinances, or while these ordinances were being adopted, our board, composed of elected officials from all these communities, asked us to take the lead developing an education program so that we could get the word out to their residents about not using fertilizer in the summertime. So a typical offer, the old way to do this, might have been something like this. If you think about our education or environmental education that you've heard or seen, cut your fertilizer use and save the planet. Well, we all want to do that, right? But what does that mean? We get a lot of save the planet messages, right? Or you can be 0.00001% of the solution. Well, that's appealing, isn't it? Everybody wants to be one, micro, nano, whatever of the solution. That maybe doesn't work either. Or you can be the first person in your neighborhood with a freaky yard, because if you don't use fertilizer, the fear is that your yard is going to look terrible. And peer pressure is a huge, huge driver of behavior. Maybe the number one driver. Okay, so we're trying to look at this a different way, and we were asking questions like this. Who's our target audience? Well, we know it's homeowners, probably lawn care professionals, and we know it's stores, Home Depot and Walmart. We didn't really focus on people who weren't homeowners because, why? Right. If they were renting a house and they had control over the yard, or they did the yard care, yes. But if you're living in apartments where they don't have any control over the yard care, they were not our audience, right? If they're living in a condominium and they don't have control over either hiring someone to care for their yard or doing it themselves, we realized that was not. So we had to narrow the audience, because the more narrow and focused your audience, the more likely you are to be successful. So who's our audience? What is it that we want them to do? What makes it hard or easy for them to do what we want them to do? And what do they care about? Because if you can connect the behavior that you want them to engage in with something that they care about, then you're halfway home. So for our campaign, again, I said social marketing is a science-based, methodical process. So we didn't just write a bunch of messages down and attach them to darts and throw them at a dartboard and see which one, hit the bullseye. We actually did some work to figure out who our audience was and what education had already been done about fertilizer, what research had already been done about fertilizer practices and attitudes about yards, and to know where our audience was living, kind of the percentage that were caring for their own yard versus having a professional care for their yard, income level, demographics, a lot of information that goes into really being successful with a marketing campaign. And when you see ads on television, you can tell, think about this, or online ads, now digital ads, you are being targeted constantly, right? You see that, I see that, I've taken advantage of that with this campaign. You're being targeted constantly, and the companies targeting you, or the causes targeting you, know what you like, don't they? They They know where you like to eat, they know what your hobbies are, they know what music you like, and you are increasingly receiving ads that speak to your lifestyle. But you can use that knowledge for good with education. We also did a really cool thing. We did secret shopper surveys at retail outlets where I used volunteers from our community advisory committee to go into Home Depot and Lowe's with just 4 questions. And they couldn't like say, I'm here to ask you some questions and then read off the list. They had to remember what the questions were, but they were questions like, I've heard that fertilizer is bad, can be bad if there's something in fertilizer that might be bad for our waters. Can you tell me about that? And to see if the salesperson could answer that question, and ask a question like, well, I've heard that I shouldn't put fertilizer down in the summer. Ask about that. Can you tell me what the 3 numbers on a fertilizer bag mean? That's essential. The 3 essential components of fertilizer are what? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, right, NPK. So what we learned from these secret shopper surveys was that a lot of people who work at the retail stores don't know this basic information. Yet, we learned from our focus groups that the 2 major sources of information about fertilizer are, number 1, what do you think that is? The number 1 source where people got information about how they should care for their yard. No, well, in some cases, yeah, they got nasty grams from that, and that actually, that bears, yes, that has a great bearing on lawn care and fertilizer use. But, number 1, yes ma'am.
The people making the fertilizer.
Pardon me?
The people making the fertilizer.
Yes, number 2 were garden centers like Walmart or Home Depot or Lowe's. Number 2, that was the second most commonly cited source of information. But number 1,
Neighbors?
yes, neighbors. Yep. Yep, that's where peer pressure comes in. Neighbors and family. So their own networks. People tend to believe, they go to their neighbors for advice, they go to family members. That was the number 1 source, followed by the stores and, to some extent, fertilizer manufacturers with advertising. And this is the point where you see red on down that I was able to bring on Salter Mitchell to help. We initially did on our own the focus groups, and we did the secret shopper surveys. So we had a pretty good idea of how people were using fertilizer, how much they were using, where they were getting information, and what they were being told. And then it's like, okay, what do we do with all this stuff? So that's when we brought on the experts who helped us look at other relevant research, figure out who our audience was, and develop the messaging. And the test messages, it's you don't have to spend a lot of money for that. We had ad concepts, billboard ads, print ads, digital ad concepts, and actually 3 of us went out one day and we went to a parking lot at a Walmart, a parking lot at a Starbucks, a parking lot at a Panera, and we intercepted people going in or coming out. We offered them like a $5 gift card if they would, look at some messages we had and tell us what they thought of them. So that was really, really helpful. We got a broad cross-section of people, by doing that. So testing doesn't have to be really hard or really expensive. You just have to get enough people. It doesn't have to be a huge number, but enough people so that you're fairly confident that they are representative of your audience. Okay, our target audience are homeowners. This is pretty much your typical Florida yard, right? This is it. There's a big house. There's a few little shrubs. You can barely see them. They're planted right along the house. And then there's a lot of grass. It's the grass that we wanted to go after because grass uses the most water, requires the most water to maintain, the most fertilizer, the most care. It's the most resource-intensive landscape we have in Florida. So we had to go after this because this is where the fertilizer was being used. What did we want them to do? Did we want them to fertilize appropriately? What does that mean? If I told you you need to fertilize appropriately, what would you think that meant? That could mean something different to everybody in here, right? If I told you that in order to fertilize appropriately, you have to read the label on the bag of fertilizer, then you have to calibrate your fertilizer spreader, and you have to measure the square footage of your yard, what would you tell me?
No.
Exactly. You say, forget it. I'm too busy. I got class. I'm going out. You know, I got the kids to take care of. I got to get one kid to soccer. I got to get the other kid to piano. You know, homeowners don't have time for that. We thought about it, and we said, this is our message. This is the message. We have fertilizer ordinances that say you can't use fertilizer in the summer, so that's our message at its simplest. And it's something that we knew we could measure and evaluate. So what makes it hard when you're talking about fertilizer or lawn care or any behavior change? As we've discussed, what makes it hard is peer pressure. If your neighbors all have lush green lawns, you're going to want that too. Really, most of us don't want to be pioneers. Most of us don't want to stand out from the crowd. Most of us want to fit in. Most of us don't want to be the outlier. Some of us do, and thank God for those people because they changed the world, right? But most of us, you know, don't want to be too different from our networks, the people that we associate with on a day-to-day basis. So peer pressure is very, very strong. And you said earlier, homeowner associations, that makes it very hard because the perception is that a lush green lawn is the most desirable kind of landscape, right? And a lot of that perception in Florida is driven by the fact that many, many millions of people in Florida have moved here from somewhere else, up north particularly, where they can grow those lush green lawns. They might only grow them for 2 or 3 months out of the year, but let me tell you, Pennsylvania's got beautiful grass. Michigan has beautiful grass in the summertime. Without all this work that we have to go through in Florida. Florida is humid, it's hot, it's loaded with bugs, it's loaded with fungus, it's loaded with disease for turf grass. So this is not a hospitable climate for turf grass, and yet, so that's why it takes so many resources to maintain lawns. So we found out, what do these people care about? We asked them, you know, what do you care about? They cared about having fun. They cared specifically about having fun on or around the water. Isn't that a main reason that you think people live here, or you live here? To kayak, to go to the beach, to drink little umbrella drinks at a waterfront restaurant, to fish. I fish, so that's important to me. To boat, to jet ski, to paddleboard. We asked people about their yards, and then most of them said, I am concerned about the appearance of my yard. I am concerned. I want it to look good. You know, I don't want to get a nasty gram from my HOA. I don't want my neighbors to think I'm not doing my part to keep up the neighborhood. But when you delve deeper through the focus groups that we held, we also found out that they were very, very frustrated in general at the amount of time and effort and money it took them to maintain this landscape, to the point where a lot of them just said, oh, to heck with it, and I'm going to hire a company to do it for me. And they had no idea what was going on in their landscape. They just get a little notice that says, you know, so-and-so was here today, and they did pest control, or they put down fertilizer, but they were completely disconnected from their landscape. To a person, everyone said that if they had a choice, they would rather spend less time on yard work and more time having fun on the water. So, okay, wow, that's our hook, isn't it? Right there, we have our campaign. The result was a campaign called Be Floridian. And the goal is to get people to comply with these fertilizer ordinances that ban use of nitrogen in the summertime. And secondly, and this is a big goal of most social marketing, is kind of to create a new norm, to convince people that by changing their behavior, they're really not going to be the outliers, they're not going to be different, but it's a new norm, a new identity. Being Floridian is not using fertilizer in the summer. Of course, we all know that. Every Floridian knows that. All true Floridians know that. And that's kind of the norm that we're trying to create. And we had another goal, because we have so many people in Florida who've moved here from somewhere else. These are more the subliminal messages to target those people with this message of design your yard for the place you live now. So, our mascot, plastic pink yard flamingo. And immediately from all my environmental friends, because I'm an environmental educator, and I knew this was going to happen, from the beginning, why did you choose that? Flamingos aren't native to Florida. Why didn't you choose a roseate spoonbill? Why did you choose a flamingo? Well, wild flamingos are not native to Florida. Actually, they are, and they're coming back as far as South Florida, but they're not native to the Tampa Bay area. But the plastic pink yard flamingo is. So, it's an easy answer. And for everyone would think about that for a minute, and then the smile would come across their face, and they would say, you're right. I see plastic pink yard flamingos everywhere. You see them in Colorado. You see them in Maine. You see them all over Florida. My grandmother, who lived in Palatka, anybody know where Palatka is? I'm from Gainesville, actually. Sorry, I'm a Gator. But my grandmother, who lived in Palatka, had plastic pink yard flamingos in her yard. And I think a lot of people in Florida did in the 1960s and 70s, and they're popular still. So that was how our mascot came to be. And what we are trying again is to promote less of this and more of this. This is what we would call a Florida-friendly landscape. You know, it might have some grass, a little grass, smaller areas, maybe grass only for dogs or for a little, seating area, but it mainly has plants, right? Plants that are drought tolerant, plants that are tough, plants that are suited for Florida's really harsh climate. And this is still what we see, isn't it? This is hard. This is very hard. We've had probably 2 or 3 centuries of focusing, going back to England, where having a big lush lawn was a status symbol. The lords and ladies had these big kind of manicured lawns, right? So of course you want to aspire to have that. This is a long-held value system that's very difficult to change. But I'm proud to say I have no grass in my yard, so I have a Florida-friendly landscape. So what we did, first of all, we did a website because we knew that we were going to have some way to evaluate our messaging. And one really easy way to do that, or good way, is to have all of your messaging linked to a website, because you can use analytics for a website, can't you? You can tell who's going there, you can tell how long they stayed on your website, and you can tell where they went. So we started basically with the website. Our message, protect our fun. Protect the waters that make living here fun. Simply protect our fun. So skip the fertilizer this summer and save our bays and lakes, or save our Gulf, or save our rivers for fun. And then we have this less lawn equals more fun, and there's our happy little plastic pink yard flamingo. These are some of the billboards that we did. Again, pretty much relax, it's the responsible thing to do. That's a message about fun, right? This guy is hanging out on his boat. He's not thinking about fertilizing his yard. And so the poor schmo who's sitting there, on Sunday driving to buy his fertilizer, sees this and goes, what? I need to to be doing this. And we also had some messages that were kind of more emotional, and I would say kind of more typical of an environmental kind of save the planet message, but in a casual, fun sort of way. Skip the fertilizer, the Gulf will thank you. And here you have, the Gulf is saying thanks. I just realized that cursor is there. Okay, we did bus wraps. We did these about 3 years ago. I don't know if any of you remember seeing, we had 4 park buses, express buses, that went from Tampa to Pinellas County that were completely wrapped with our message. And everything, again, you can see the web address. But these are difficult to evaluate. You know how many people roughly will see this in a day, because Hart and billboard companies are very good at telling you the number of impressions or the number of motorists who are likely to see your message. It's more difficult to figure out what they did with that message, or if they made the behavior change you're asking, unless, again, you have a website or you're using social media, which is also has analytics, so you can track where people are coming in and how they're getting there. But this was a really good way to get the message out, because if you're driving along, you're going to see this, if nothing else. These were bright orange buses. You couldn't miss them. And I actually did a fun little contest to have people tell me where they saw the bus. And I had like little random drawings for prizes, so I could get some sort of feedback on how many people were seeing this and if it was registering. We even did garbage trucks. It was kind of a stretch for us to connect a fertilizer message to a trash message, but I think we did a good job, and this is thanks to Salter Mitchell for coming up with the message of don't throw away fun. So I have 4 garbage trucks in Largo that have wraps like this on them. And my friends in Pinellas County, who are awesome, very progressive, have put custom vehicle wraps on 18 of their county vehicles that are out and about the county constantly every day. This is a stormwater inspection. It has a camera system on it. It actually sends a camera down into stormwater pipes to detect leaks and corrosion so they can repair that. This is a Largo. Largo has 2 of these vehicles, and Pinellas County has 18 that are wrapped with different messages. And because in Tampa and Pinellas counties, the ordinances told stores they simply could not sell products that they had been selling for a long, long time, we knew we had to work with them, and we wanted to make it a positive experience rather than a punitive experience. So we told them we would provide materials for their customers. You tell us how much space you want, how big you want these things to be. Because if you work in retail, anybody work in retail, space is your #1 consideration, right? So they didn't want to give up a lot of their space to sell products for us to put educational stuff in there. So we came up with the idea of these stand-up corrugated cardboard flamingos, which actually right here have a little brochure rack attached to them, and we put in little rack cards that customers could pick up with very, very simple tips under the heading, How to Fertilize Like Floridian. And tells you June through September, here's your little tips, and October through May. We also did tear-off pads that could be attached to the shelves where the fertilizer products used to be, would have been, were not anymore in the summertime, although there are a lot of summer compliant products that they could sell. And the idea was to, because we learned through our secret shopper surveys that the salespeople were not fertilizer experts. They were not necessarily giving their customers good information. So we said, well, let's just, take that out of the equation and let's provide self-service information for the customers. We did provide little tip cards for salespeople that were just laminated little index cards that they could carry in their pocket or their vest or their apron, depending on where they worked, and pull it out and refer to it when someone said, why aren't you selling my Scott's Turf Builder anymore? And they could say, well, we have an ordinance now and we can't sell that. But then they could take them to the products that, they were able to sell, and there were a lot of them. And more as time went on, because Florida companies really took advantage of a vacuum there and rushed in to produce some really good nitrogen-free products. So we provided material so the customers could serve themselves, and we didn't have to work with, we didn't have to worry about the information they were being given. And we did banners for them, emphasizing what they could sell rather than what they couldn't sell. That says, jump into our summer safe yard products. And there were a lot of them. We did a lot of digital advertising. When you go on Google, when you go on Facebook, when you go on Google+, those are all monetized now, aren't they? You will see ads everywhere. And again, those ads target you. So we were able to do the same thing. We did search engine marketing. We did a lot of ads on local websites like the Tampa Bay Times, Bay News 9. We also did ads on Google, Bing, Yahoo, and they were tagged to keywords. So if someone was searching, doing an internet search for fertilizer, for gardening, for lawn care, for home improvement, our ads might appear to them on their search engine browser, because we were targeting people of a certain age, living in, that we thought were most likely to be homeowners, living in a certain geographic location, and searching for specific information on the web. Those were very, very successful for us, and they're relatively inexpensive. With a click-through ad, you're only paying if someone clicks through to your website, clicks on your ad, right? And now, it's changed now with Facebook, which I'm sure you're aware of, and we've gone really heavily into Facebook advertising. So this is an example. This is me. I was searching for information about milkweeds because I love butterfly gardening. So I was searching for milkweeds one day, and I'm like, oh my God, there's my ad. There's my ad. I fit the profile, right? So here's my ad. Less yard work, more fun. That's as simple as it is. There's not even a picture there. We had amazing success. I think it was the less yard work, more fun. Again, I think that really appeals to people. And Facebook ads. This is actually my yard in Seminole Heights. I have no grass. I'm very proud of that. And I have a really funky backyard. It's really fun. So we had Facebook ads. These are sidebar ads. And again, people would click on the ad, and they would go to our website. We also had a lot of shareable graphics. This was a really fun campaign that my partners in Sarasota County did. They did this alternative uses for a fertilizer spreader. Well, isn't this a great use? Let me go back. I went ahead. It's a cooler on the beach. So there were some where they had, there were ads where they were using it as a bait bucket for people who were fishing, as a tackle to carry your tackle in. There was another ad where they had two little kids, like they were using it as a stroller. But again, it's playing to what we want to do rather than spend time on yard work. It's have fun. I mean, wouldn't you rather be sitting there than, fertilizing your yard, mowing your yard because you fertilize it and the grass is growing like crazy? Last year I did a lot of shareable infographics, and I saw that on your list of projects, as some of you are interested in shareable infographics. I love shareable infographics, and I wanted to pass around my favorite source of infographics. I have little sticky notes here, which is National Geographic. They do an incredible job of graphically, I'm just going to start, start back here. They do an incredible job, if y'all would just pass those around, of displaying a huge amount of information in a very visually compelling way. You're learning without even knowing it. In fact, you're sitting there and you're going, wow, I didn't know that. But that's an example, and there are lots of other examples. We did this shareable infographic, how to fluoridify your yard with the fam, with your family. So you can plant a butterfly garden, you can make a pond, you can make a compost bin, all these different ideas. And we kind of had, this is things you can do for animals, this is things related to nature, and these are kind of art projects you could do with your kids. And on our website, we actually had these as clickable links that took you to tips for doing the various little fun with your family activities. We did a pledge. I saw that on your list too, and I know that Maya has a pledge for microplastics. Research shows that if someone actually signs a pledge, fills out a pledge, puts their name to something, that they're more likely to follow through with whatever they've pledged. So we did the same thing. We did a pledge through all of these different mechanisms, and we gave out really good prizes, including free yard makeover consultations. So we had 5 winners of that, and I had some of our business partners donate those. Here was an example of our Facebook pledge. So you could pledge to do one of these things. These are all clickable links. Dying by the water. I mean, this was a really fun print ad that says, "Sorry, babe, Florida needs me at the beach." So we had a lot of really fun ads that really played to, you need to get out in Florida and have fun instead of worrying about your grass. So you could click one of these, fill out your name and email, and you could enter the drawing or sign up for our newsletter if you wanted to do that, and you would be entered to win one of our prizes. So what worked for us, search engine marketing and Facebook were by far our most cost-effective and successful ways of delivering our message, which surprised the heck out of me. I come from an era when our idea of education, we were talking about this before the class, was, well, let's just make a brochure about it. Well, things have really changed, and, you know, I'm an old dog, I'm having to learn new tricks. So search engine marketing was extremely successful, drove most of the traffic to our website, and last year we exclusively did Facebook advertising, and we did not do any Google or Bing advertising at all, and that was very successful for us as well. And the organic reach, you know what this is. This is not ad-based. This is just me posting on a Facebook page, which you have to do in addition to the Facebook advertising, because if you're going to do social media of any type, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Snapchat, whether it's Instagram, you've got to be there all the time. You can't post once a week and think that that's, or once a month and think that that's enough. You really have to maintain it. So I post something on our Be Floridian Facebook page every day or so, and sometimes twice a day. So how do we do? We did an initial pop-up survey, so people who went to our website, randomly a survey would pop up and they could choose to take it. And if they weren't in our target audience, they didn't live in Tampa Bay or they weren't a homeowner, they got kind of said thank you and exited out of the survey. If they met the profile, then they took the survey. And part of that included campaign recall. So we would show them one of our billboards and ask if they had seen it before, or show them a vehicle round. Have you seen this? Can you remember where you saw it? But we also asked them, you know, are you changing anything? So these are the really positive responses we got. And this is pretty significant, that 29% said they would reduce the amount of grass in their landscape. So that was pretty good. That's the real long-term sustainable change. This is just something you can do right now. It's a short-term change, but this is where we want to head over the long run. We came back and did a survey this year, another survey to see where our metrics were now. And we've done a really good job of getting across to homeowners that summer is not the best time to put fertilizer down. And most people, a majority of people, don't even fertilize their lawns at all. And very, very few people identified any summer months as being a good time to apply fertilizer. So that's good. That means that people do know summer is not a good time to put fertilizer down. And we looked at their intent to act. Sometimes with social marketing, you want to measure what people intend to do, what they're actually doing, and then what they think others are doing. Do they think everybody else they know is doing this too? Because again, remember, most of us don't want to be the odd duck in the crowd. So we looked at intent to act, and a really good majority of people said they would be less likely to fertilize in the summer because of something they had seen, read, or listened to about fertilizer. And we also did some very expensive and very in-depth social surveys related to a research project we were doing that involved random telephone surveys and in-person, in-depth homeowner interviews in some targeted home, deed-restricted communities to figure out, did they know there was an ordinance in effect, and how did it change their behavior? And from that, we learned that Pinellas County residents, by and far, were far more aware of fertilizer ordinances and of appropriate fertilizer practices, including not fertilizing in the summer, and they applied less fertilizer than residents of our other counties. The highest fertilizer rate was in Hillsborough County, and there's a reason for this. Pinellas County has the strongest ordinance, right? Pinellas County and Tampa have the strongest ordinances. People would go in and try to buy something in the summer they'd always used before, and they were told, no, we don't have it anymore because there's an ordinance. In Hillsborough County, they don't have an ordinance that strong. So there's no restriction on sales. There's no ban of use of fertilizer in the summer. So people in Hillsborough County just aren't as aware, simply because Pinellas County has a much stronger ordinance and enforcement and education that goes along with that. So what did we learn? This is what really will relate to you with your microplastics project. First of all, know your audience and focus your message. You know, you're not going to be able to do a message for all audiences. I saw lots of great ideas on your list relating to other students, to professors in the university community, to the greater public at large, to K through 12 students. So whatever you're doing in your small groups, pick one audience, right? Don't try to pick all audiences. Don't assume you know what's best. If I could leave you, that's why I have it in red. Don't assume that the message that you come up with is going to be the one that resonates with your audience. And engage people where they are, and increasingly they're on mobile devices, and increasingly they're on some kind of social media. I'm an old fart, so you know, all my peer group is using Facebook. What are you guys using now? Facebook still, okay, what else?
Twitter's my jam.
And Twitter, I love Twitter. Although I'm not happy about Twitter potentially going past the 120 character limit.
Mm-hmm. They're talking about a 10,000 character limit?
I know.
Which is like, what's the point?
I know. It's like, I'll just read a newspaper.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
Yeah.
Fun is better than fear. I think in the environmental realm, there's a lot of doom and gloom, isn't there? We deliver a lot of doom and gloom messages. But this campaign has taught me that there is a way to deliver that message that doesn't just depress the heck out of people to the point where they go, you know, I can't do anything about global warming. I can't do anything about polar bears. I can't do anything about the ivory trade. And people just say, what can I do about these big issues? But this is something where using fun, you can really, and a simple message, show them that they can make a difference. And I would like to say that water quality in Tampa Bay has been improving for 30 years. And last year we had more seagrasses, underwater seagrasses, than we've had at any time since 1950. So that's amazing. We have a region with 2.7 million people living around this bay, and we're seeing improvements. So it can be done. There is hope, and that's a message that we don't deliver often enough. We also learned homeowner associations are still our major barrier to getting people to change attitudes and practices in their landscape. And landscape professionals are a major barrier too, because they don't, you know, it's hard for them to change the way they've been doing business, in some cases for 30 or 40 years. And, you know, involving people rather than just telling them what they should do is really important. Sometimes it's really not important that they know everything about a topic, just that they know one thing they can do to make a difference. and jargon. I deal with that constantly. I work with a lot of PhD scientists. I have to translate their science speak. So we tend to use a lot of jargon. There's always a simpler way to say something because you don't need to know people how smart you don't need to tell people how smart you are. You're trying to engage them in doing something to help. So it's about reaching them and communicating with them. And don't be afraid to fail. I heard this at a conference. I stole it. I love it. You can't learn from your mistakes if you never make any. And I think all of us learn best the hard way, right? So one example I want to leave you with, an example of not assuming you know what's best. This is a billboard that I loved. Salter Mitchell came up with this billboard idea. This is going right at the whole lush green lawn. This would be a giant billboard. Picture this billboard on Ormerton Road or 275 in Tampa. Big lush green lawn, not Florida. That's our whole message, Design your yard for the place you live now. We tested this. I was one of the people who went out in the parking lots at Walmart and Starbucks, and I showed people this. And I said, what do you think about this? What does this say to you? They said, it says that green lawns are beautiful. And, oh my God, how did they get a lawn that looks that good? My lawn doesn't look that good. I had one woman who told me she had ripped out all her grass because she was so tired of replacing it year after year after year when it died. And she had replaced it all with native plants. She looked at this and she said, if I could have had a yard like that, I'd have kept my grass. So, whoa, okay. In 2 hours, we realized this is a really bad message and a bad delivery tool. So that's an example of not assuming that you know what will work. That's the value of testing. So these are all my partners. Been a privilege to work with them for 5 years on this campaign, and thank you. And I would love to hear about your projects and how this might have helped you, or if this has just confused and overwhelmed you, and how you're planning to address your projects for the microplastics campaign. Is everybody asleep now?
Well, since we were talking about this at dinner, we haven't solidified the teams yet. But I'm sure some of you have, I know some of you, because we talked about it last week, have specific things that you're already thinking about, hoping to do.
Yeah, I saw the long list of great ideas. Do you guys have any questions? Anybody still awake?
You're usually so talkative. What's going on?
I know. God,
Is it
you're making me
mid-semester? Is
feel
that what's
really
going on?
bad now.
Yeah.
But did you raise the funds to develop this campaign? Like, do you work with other partners?
Yes.
And
Yes.
grants? Do you get grants?
Yes, I did get grants. We have spent about $400,000 in 5 years on this campaign, which sounds like a tremendous amount of money. But think about the cost of one 30-second Super Bowl ad. We could not afford even a 30-second ad on local television, like during, Bay News 9 or Channel 8 News, because it's so prohibitive. So for me, working in government, to have that kind of money was truly like someone, gave me, robbed a bank for me. But it really was not a lot of money, so we had to be very, very careful about how we spent it. And I did get grants that helped. And surprisingly, I was not eligible for this campaign for a lot of grants because they wanted printed materials. Environmental grants all want a document, a manual, a brochure. It's very difficult for people to wrap their heads around new messaging that involves non-traditional tools, like digital ads. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm kind of like more concerned about what was your methodology. You were showing the latest, that ad that you guys tested it and might be
Didn't work.
out. Yeah, what was the methodology or idea originally to come up with that? I'm just trying to see kind of like the opposite side. What was the ideas that kind of like made you to decide to use that ended up didn't working? So then you learn from the mistakes that you guys had and
Right,
you try not to do them from the beginning.
right. We did a lot of research, including the focus groups that I told you about. And those are, you bring people in who fit your target audience. You put them all in a room and you have a very skilled facilitator moderate a discussion with them of whatever issue it is. And companies do this all the time. You can probably even participate in paid marketing surveys and make money doing it. And so we talked to them in depth for about 2 hours. We paid them to be there, about $100 for their time. And we also did it online where people didn't have to leave their house. They could participate by computer. We were able to actually get a higher income demographic that way. People who didn't care about money, but they were kind of intrigued by the whole idea. So that gave us a lot of information about who our audience was, how they viewed their landscapes, and what would make them change a behavior related to their landscaping. That and the demographic research, the audience segmentation, as well as looking at research that had been done all around the country and in Florida related to fertilizer use. And from that, then looking at the results of all of that and brainstorming is where we came up with the message of Be Floridian. That's where having professional marketing consultants who are amazing really, really paid off.
So how long did it take for the entire implementation of like the website and all the ads?
We had, we did the focus groups and the secret shopper surveys in 1 year while ordinances were being adopted all around the region. The website, the billboards, print ads all went up 1 year. We did billboards for 2 years. So we put it all together in about a 6-month period. And then our major campaign each year was in the spring and the summer, because when it starts to get warm, that's when people start thinking about getting out in their yards and working in their yards. So if they're going to make any changes in their landscape, that's the time to hit them. Before they get started on replacing their grass and fertilizing, and that's endless cycle, that's the time to hit them. And then we did the campaign throughout summer to remind people that they could use fertilizer in the summer. So we did a different campaign. In the off-season, we developed the materials and the messaging for the next year, and it all was under that Be Floridian and the Protect Our Fund theme, and then implemented the campaign for 6 months. Yes?
I don't understand how homeowners associations can have so much power.
I don't either. Because when you, yes, and they have amazing power. There is a couple in Jacksonville, and the gentleman is an orthopedic surgeon. He has a lot of money. He has fought his homeowners association, and he just won $100,000 in legal fees later. He just won. They can take your house, and they have. When you buy a property in a deed-restricted community, you're signing a contract that says that you will abide by certain restrictions on, like for instance, even the color of your house, what kind of vehicles you can park outside your house. I told you my husband is a little bit older than I am. When I met him, he was living in a deed-restricted 55 and over community in Newport Richey. He had just turned 55. He was the only one there still working. I mean, literally everybody else in there was like 75 or 80 years old. He got nasty grams continually. One time he got a nasty gram, which we saved, and we have to this day, from the homeowner association because he had 5 pieces of fruit on the ground. that he had not picked up. So, part of it I understand, people buy in a community because they want to live in a nice home with a nice landscape. And they don't want to live by somebody who has, cars up on concrete blocks and rat-heeled sofas out on their porch and a weed-filled yard, that's with weeds that high. So the deed restrictions serve a purpose in, protecting the quality of life and the property values of people in that neighborhood. But, in some cases, the homeowner associations, those are generally people that are elected from within the community. And in some cases, they go overboard. And in many cases, it's a lot of people who have moved down here from somewhere else. And that is their vision of what the ideal landscape is. The state did pass a law about 10 years ago now that says that even that you cannot prevent someone from implementing Florida-friendly landscaping, even if they live in a deed-restricted community. You cannot force people to have to water a landscape more often than watering restrictions in a community say you can. But there's very little solid case law yet because homeowners send nastygrams to someone and they can carry it out and out and out for years because they have an attorney on retainer. And so they just kind of outgun and outspend the homeowner. And a lot of times the homeowner just gives up and just sells the house and moves. Or they end up having to rip out their Florida-friendly landscape and replace it with sod. Now, a lot of times what people say is a Florida-friendly landscape is an unmaintained, neglected, weed-filled mess. So there is an orderly Florida-friendly landscape, and then there's just somebody who says, I have a Florida yard, I don't do anything to it. You can't not take care of a landscape in Florida, a yard. It'll just go crazy on you. Everything will grow here. Everything bad will grow in your yard. So, in some cases, the homeowners are probably in the wrong, but I have seen just some gorgeous landscapes that I would be proud to live by, and people have really been hounded mercilessly in some cases by homeowner associations. So be careful when you buy a house. Make sure you read those restrictions. You should be allowed to change your landscape if you follow guidelines, allegedly, and if you get approval beforehand. But the cases where homeowners have won in Florida-friendly landscaping have been where the homeowner association failed to respond within the time allotted in their deed restrictions for their request to change their landscape. They've submitted landscape designs, a lot of times created by landscape designers that are beautiful, and the homeowner association has not responded within the time frame in which they are supposed to respond according to their deed restrictions. That's how they're winning. It's a breach of contract, essentially, not on the merits of that landscape versus turf grass.
And that's how, who's winning, the homeowner association?
Yes.
Oh.
No, when the homeowners have won, it's because the homeowner association has failed to fulfill its responsibility to respond to their request. You can't just, if you live in a deed restricted community, you can't just rip out all your grass and plant whatever you want. You often will have to submit a design that shows them this is what I want to change to. It can be something you draw yourself, and you'll have to sometimes go before a landscape committee and talk to them about what you want to do. But if you submit a request through the proper protocols, following your deed restrictions, and they don't respond to you within the 90 days or the 60 days or whatever it says in their covenants, then that's how homeowners are winning.
It was really nice presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, if people really want to maintain their beautiful yards, do you have any alternative suggestion, like
Yes.
giving information or connect organized?
Yes. On our website and on our Facebook page, we feature a Florida Yard Gallery That is pictures from around the area of landscapes that look good and save water and don't use fertilizer. We have a lot of those to give people real-world ideas of what they can do. We have lots of, we have like a little tip sheet that they can follow. We have plant profiles. We tell people, you know, where they can buy plants, what works well in what areas. And we also promote, you know, reducing grass. That's a big thing. Reducing grass and reducing water use, because that's all related. It's all part of a sustainable landscape. You know, it's really, you can't, if you're going to save water, you're probably not going to be using fertilizer, right? Because the more fertilizer you use, the more stuff grows, the more water it needs. So it all connects, just as what you are trying to do with sustainability, all connects.
Last question before we take a break? I'm thinking about time. Anybody got one last question?
I think I overwhelmed you. Pardon me? How can you volunteer? Well, in this campaign, we don't have a volunteer component. That's a good question. We do have volunteer work days, and you can sign up for those on our website. We have one coming up in Tampa at McCain Bay Nature Park in March. But I think with your microplastics program there, that is a volunteer monitoring program primarily, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So probably part of what some of you are thinking about doing is how do you recruit volunteers? Yeah. And how do you, and that's hard. You know, recruiting volunteers is not easy, especially for something like that. That's more than walking along a beach and picking up trash. You know, this would require training for these people because you're talking about collecting data that, you know, has some scientific basis.
Okay. In the interests of a break, let's say thank you to Nanette. 10 minutes?
Yes, 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Yes. And I'm sure we can convince
So that we will end on time. Cable is walking Nanette to her car. I often do that, but since Cable has a black belt in karate, she's actually a better, safer escort protector than a 59-year-old guy would have given back. We can talk about a couple of the things Nanette said perhaps later. I wanted to go ahead, since it's here and it's time and I have you do the reading, to talk about argumentation and deliberative rhetoric, which is your next assignment. So what do you think of when you think about an argument? Hey, you, outside with me. You think so? Yeah, me and you, outside, buddy, in the parking lot. You want a piece of me? All right, Andy. You know, there's an argument. Yeah, I gotta wake you guys up. It's midterms and it's 7:30 at night. All right, so when you think about an argument, he said, I'll back up one more. Your assignment. We did the epidictic accommodation. We're now going to talk about deliberative accommodation. I will talk about what deliberative rhetoric is, but you are going to take one of the 3 articles you wrote and accommodate it, change it, shift it, its problem, its structure, its argument, so that you're talking to people who are interested in policy. The 2 examples we gave you to read are deliberative, and the lecture is there are arguments for a particular policy or arguments that goodwill in a white paper should do a particular kind of thing. So he said, click. What is deliberative rhetoric? In one sentence or less, deliberative rhetoric is what happens when you answer somebody's question, well, what should we do? You know, should we go to war and pick your foreign country? We do it about every 5 years. And should we go to war in Iraq? Should we go to war in Afghanistan? Deliberative rhetoric. Should we ban high potassium, high nitrogen fertilizer during the summer? People are arguing about this. They're deliberating. There isn't, you know, a 2 + 2 = 4. You have to give somebody good reasons, persuade them that they ought to be doing something. if you hear nothing else tonight, what you know about your assignment of a deliberative accommodation is you were trying to say, I'm gonna take the information in the piece I read and use that to propose a policy to someone, a particular someone or some group of people, and say, this is what you should do. You should be doing X, here's your policy. You should stop selling cigarettes in your store. Deliberative rhetoric answers the question, what should we do? Usually you hear it in legislature or regulatory decision makers, people who are in organizations and are deciding what their organization policy should be. USF, should we give paid maternity leave to faculty? Should we give paid maternity leave to male faculty whose spouses have had a baby? You know, you have to, when my wife and I adopted a baby, we got 0 time off, not a nanosecond of time from teaching to travel to China and adopt a 13-month-old baby. You know, should the organization do it? Should we adopt a policy? To get somebody to do that, you propose a policy and then you're making an argument, giving them good reasons for why they should do this. This is the core of your next assignment. Deliberative rhetoric, if forensic rhetoric tends to be about the past, this is what happened, here are the facts of e-waste. Epideictic rhetoric tends to be about the present, here's what's happening now. Deliberative rhetoric, because it's about what we ought to do, is always about the future. It tends to reframe, and I will show you examples of this, reframe scientific issues as legislative or regulatory problems. The scientific issue is, how can we determine exactly how much e-waste there is and how dangerous is it? The legislative and regulatory problem, say for goodwill, as you will see shortly in that white paper, is, you know, our problem is we have this burden of what to do with it when people donate it at night, and we're stuck with this. The problem isn't how much is there, but what do we do with this stuff that we can't get rid of that's costing us a lot of money? Typically, when you make an appeal to somebody from a deliberative argument about what they ought to do, you are appealing to their sense of practicality. You should do this because it's actually practical and it'll work. That it's efficient, it increases your efficiency, and that it protects you, it's self-preservation. We will look at these 3 appeals when we look at the 2 examples. I will talk specifically about the policy statement 527 from the Association of Civil Engineers and about the Goodwill white paper. I'm going to be moving at some speed so that we will get through this and have time to talk about the assignment. If I leave pieces out, this is all written up and posted as a lecture. The lecture is more connected than I'm going to be because I don't want to be here all night. So when you think about an argument, you see arguments everywhere. Any of you who go to temple or go to church, that's what your priest, your rabbi, your imam does. They're giving you an argument. It's called a sermon. About what you should do. Scientific reports are arguments about testing a hypothesis or an argument that an experiment was properly done and you can trust its conclusions. The piece you read by an Oxford philosopher named Steve Toulmin says, we want to think about arguments on the model of jurisprudence, lawyers arguing in court. It's the kind of argument we are all most familiar with. None of you are as old as me and you don't remember the Perry Mason show. Perry Mason, the great lawyer who was always brilliant at convincing a jury to exonerate his client because he gave him great arguments. You know, you wouldn't want that guy arguing against you. These days, it's what, LA Law, Suits, what are the Legal Eagle TV shows?
How to Get Away with Murder.
Oh, yes.
How to Get Away with Murder,
That's
yes.
the one.
Think about that as a model of argumentation. That's actually what this book, The Uses of Argument, does. Is think about practical argumentation. How people use arguments in everyday life. So, Toulmin, and I'm going to leave out the history, this is in the lecture, but there was a movement back in the middle of the 20th century that said, let's not think about abstract theory and pure logic. That is not how arguments actually work in the world. Let's think about the way people use arguments every day in the world around you, what those arguments look like, and what we can learn from them. And one of the useful things that Toulmin learns, and he says this in the introduction, he says, he's asking, in what ways do the formalities and structures of argument change, or what ways do they not change, as we move from one sort of claim to another, or between arguments in different fields? And when he talks about fields here, know what slide I'm on. His term, argument fields, is going to be really interesting to us. I'll talk about this in a minute. But if nothing else, what you need to learn, take away from this is, if arguments change as they go from one field, a scientific argument to a religious argument to an argument about art or aesthetics, there isn't a recipe. There's no single argument structure that's always appropriate. A good argument depends on the field, the group of people, the kind of argument you're trying to make. And I will give you some examples of this. So, Toulmin tries to define this notion of an argument field, and he says, and I'll belabor this because it's a powerful notion, a field is arguments that share the same kinds of evidence or the same kind of criteria for judging the strength of an argument. So you can have religious arguments, scientific arguments, aesthetic arguments. A religious argument is going to talk about spiritual issues. It might use the Bible as evidence. It might depend on the notions the Bible is an authoritative text. If you made that argument in a scientific field, it would fall flat on its tuchus, because that's not a kind of evidence, or if you've done the reading, a warrant, a connection between evidence and claim. It's going to work in a scientific journal. And the same is true of aesthetic arguments. His point is that there's not one inherently more or less logical way, but that the grounds, the backing, the kinds of things you do to make an argument will shift as you move from one field to another. And when you're talking about forensic rhetoric in a scientific journal, that's an argument field. When you're talking about epidictic rhetoric in National Geographic, that's a different field of argument. Different people, different readers, different problems, different kinds of evidence, different kinds of appeals. Let's see. So the notion of an argument field has for us two important consequences. The first one is it explains why an argument from one kind of argumentation, one community, one group of people, one field might fail when it moves to a different field. The argument has to change when it moves from forensic rhetoric in a scientific journal to epidictic rhetoric in National Geographic to deliberative rhetoric in a policy journal. The quickest example, is everybody familiar with the Space Shuttle Challenger? It was 30 years ago last week. Okay, short version of this goes, and I'll try not to waste too much time. Within a few years of that, two of my colleagues and I published an article. We read all 5,000 pages of the Rogers Commission report multiple times, and at the end of the day, there was a meeting at Morton Thiokol, the company that made the solid rocket boosters that were on either side of the shuttle. Those are the things where the O-rings failed, blew up, and killed everybody. And on the morning they launched, NASA called Morton Thiokol and said, hey, the weather it's cold here. The temperature is below the acceptable window in which you've told us this piece of equipment can operate. Do we launch or do we not launch? What should we do? And Morton Thiokol brought all of their engineers and all of their program managers into a room and argued for 2 hours. They had a deliberative meeting. What should we do? What should we tell NASA? And if you read it, and I've read the transcripts of all of that, if you read it, Roger Beaujolais, the chief O-ring engineer, made a number of arguments to say we can't launch, and here's why. And all of his arguments were based on, let me see if I can get this right. All of his arguments were based on, here's what has happened in the past and what might happen in the future. And if we have colder launches, we can predict into the future that at the coldest, which is this launch, we will have more trouble. And all of the managers said, no, we've been pushing the envelope steadily, incrementally at lower temperatures in the past, and every time we've done it, it has worked and been successful. And why can't we continue to do what we've been doing successfully? And the other big difference is, have I talked about O-rings in here before?
I don't think so.
No? Okay. Beaujolais says, I'm a bench engineer. And in the previous coldest launch, when we pulled the SRM, the solid rocket motor, out of the ocean, popped it open, took the O-rings out, he said, we took the O-rings out and they weren't shiny, they were dull. And we really can't launch. And they all looked at it. So they didn't look shiny and we stopped the space program because they weren't shiny. What he meant was, I'm a bench engineer, and I can tell you that an O-ring is finished to an absolutely microscopic finish, and it's just like glass. It shines just like a glass surface. But if that surface is dull looking, doesn't have that shiny, that sheen on it, it means there are submicroscopic erosion on it, that something has been blowing past that O-ring and eroding the surface because it's dull looking. Trust me on this, I'm an engineer, I've been doing it for 20 years. They said, show me some data. Did you measure it? No. Do you have any data to show that there was a difference? No. He says, trust me, I saw it with my own 2 eyes. The engineer trusts his eyes. The managers want hard data. He was right. But when they took a vote, he said, they said, okay, who says we should launch? Every manager says, launch. They said, who says we should launch? Every engineer said, don't do this, could be catastrophic. No, no, no. One reading of this is the engineers are smart and the managers are. Another reading is the engineers are honest and care, and the managers are evil and all they care about is money and protecting their reputation in corporate. Maybe. But if you look at the arguments they made, the kind of arguments in engineering don't translate into management. They use different evidence. They use different kinds of data. They have, in our terms, different warrants to connect the data to the claim. And you had an argument that shifted from one field to another catastrophically. The engineering argument in the field of engineering shifts to management and program management, and the argument failed because the argument doesn't move whole from one place to another. That's actually one of the reasons, one of the causes for the Challenger disaster. So this notion of fields explains to us, why arguments fail when they move from one place to another. It also allows us to talk about what Toulmin calls the layout of arguments and how you construct a good argument. And I don't know if I have this on the next slide. Stop that. Okay. The important thing here is the last sentence. We've got the terms, data, claims, warrants, backing, qualifications, rebuttals. We'll look at this. If arguments shift from field to field, those terms don't. Those terms apply whether you're making an engineering argument or a religious argument or a management argument. And so the point I'm thinking about here is the terms refer to what a piece of an argument does, not what the content is, not what it says, but its function, its role, what it does in an argument. It's not the content, it's the function. So the functions of an argument stay the same, whether you move from one field to another. Claims are the thing you're asserting. Data is always supporting that. Warrants are always connecting the data to the claim. You need to do that. The claims can change, the data can change, but the function of what you're doing, the structure of what you're doing stays the same. Is this making some sense? I'll show you examples. That's probably the single most important thing you need to remember here. So here's Toulmin's layout. You have a claim, C. We should do X. Why should we do it? Well, I've got some data. There's a warrant. Well, since this is the case, this data actually supports this warrant because we know, and I'm going to give you an example of climate change. So that's his basic structure. It's really simple. It will apply to almost any argument you're ever going to run into. Not every argument has a qualification. Not every argument has a rebuttal. Every argument has a claim, some data, and a warrant. So his example is whether some hypothetical Harry is a British citizen. I couldn't care less about poor Harry. So let's talk about climate change. So to begin an argument, a claim or a conclusion whose merits, not truth or falsity, but whose worth and merit we want to establish and the facts that we appeal to as a foundation for that claim, what I'm going to refer to as data. So I'll give you a claim. Climate change is real and caused by human activity. As he says, somebody who doesn't believe in climate change, a skeptic might say, well, what have you got to go on? You know, what's your evidence for that? You say climate change is real, you know, and it's created by human activity. What have you got to go on? So I'm going to give you a basic argument. My claim, climate change is real, caused by human activity. Here's my data, the Keeling curve. You all know what this curve is? All right, that's the concentration of CO2 at the top of Mount Mauna Loa in the Hawaiian chain from about 1958 through 2010, and it's just going straight up. Okay, here's my argument. Climate change is real, humans have caused it because of this. But Toulmin says when you're making an argument, you need to step back a little bit from the move from data to claim, Keeling curve to claim of anthropogenic climate change. And you need to think about, in this case, what connects that data to that claim. Or he says, indicate, the skeptic might say, tell me what bearing on our conclusion claim your data has. You know, what have you got to go on? How do you get from data, Keeling curve, to climate change? What makes the Keeling curve good evidence for this claim? Anybody know what the answer is going to be? So this is where Toulmin takes up his notion of warrants. In colloquial, all right, this is where I get real funny in colloquial. In everyday experience, what's a warrant? Josh? Huh?
Like when you're served a warrant, like for your arrest?
Right. So cop Josh tells me, Professor Herndl, I have a warrant for your arrest. What does a warrant do? Besides scare the bejesus out of me. Huh?
Gets you running.
It gets you running? Yeah, I'm gonna run. A warrant is your authority. The thing that says, I have some authority to support my claim. You're under arrest. In argument theory, a warrant is what functions as a bridge between the data or evidence, the Keeling curve, and the claim, anthropogenic climate change. It authorizes us not to take Carl to jail, something I've escaped for 59 years and hope to continue to, but it authorizes us to accept the data as relevant to supporting that claim, making the jump. Unfortunately, warrants don't always cross from one argument field to another. So the simple, easy shooting ducks in a barrel here is in rural North Carolina where I grew up, you can say the world is 6,000 years old. There's my claim. You know, I grew up with people who believe this. The world is 6,000 years old. How do you know? Because the Bible says X, Y, and Z. What connects the Bible says to the world is 6,000 years old? What's the warrant that connects those? Anybody? People believe what's in the Bible. More specifically, you ever heard of biblical inerrancy? There is a big group of people who believe that the Bible is the literal Word of God, that it can't, it's like the Pope is infallible. In certain American religious communities, the notion is that the literal word of the Bible is literal fact. And if it says X, Y, and Z, then you can prove that the world is 6,000. Now that warrant is not going to move if you're not making a religious but a scientific argument. Or if you're talking to somebody who's interested in language and begins to ask you what happens to words when they shift from Sanskrit to Greek to Latin to German to French to Anglo-Saxon to English. Do the meaning of those words stay the same? You know, if you're me, you're going to say the notion that the words in your Bible, which was written, translated 100 years ago, mean the same thing as those words from 2,500 or from 2,000 years ago. That makes no sense at all. That warrant doesn't, am I making some sense? The warrant doesn't shift from one argument field or community to another, and your argument goes down the tubes. That's why the notion of warrants is sort of interesting. So I could make my argument here. My data, the Keeling curve, is good evidence for the fact that climate change is real and caused by human beings, since we know about the greenhouse gas effect. Backing, because the atmosphere is like a thin blanket that keeps the earth warm and it has to be balanced carefully. So you all know what the greenhouse gas effect is? Okay, the notion that greenhouse gases go up into the atmosphere, incident sunlight comes in, but it can't get back out into space, it's trapped and bounced back in. So the warrant that bridges my data to my claim is the notion of the greenhouse gas effect. Oddly enough, I was giving a lecture at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, where NASA has a great big facility. And I said something about climate change, and I said the basic physics of the greenhouse gas effect are settled science, and we know that. And one of the scientists in the room got furious with me and explained that that wasn't true. The greenhouse gas effect was a myth, that the physics of it are completely wrong, and that global warming doesn't exist because there's no such thing as a greenhouse gas effect. This is a guy with a PhD in physics. I found out later he's also a famous, internationally famous climate change denialist who I didn't know was in the room. But that warrant didn't move from one field, mainstream science, to the other field, the climate change deniers. And this tells you one of the things you need to know about warrants. He said, oops, went the wrong way. I'll get to the, I'm anticipating another slide, but I will do it here. One of the things about arguments is arguments are nested like little Russian eggs, one inside each other. Your argument only works, that is, it only connects your data to the claim if people accept the warrant. And the warrant is something here like the greenhouse gas effect. When somebody says, I don't believe in the greenhouse gas effect, you have to do one of two things. If you're making an argument, you have to back up and say, yeah, this now becomes a claim. Oh no, the greenhouse gas effect really exists because here's some data from physics. And what happens is before you can make this argument, you have to back up and make an argument that your warrant is valid. So if somebody wants to say the world is 6,000 years old because the Bible says so, I'm going to say, why? Well, what does that mean? He says, well, the Bible is the inerrant, literal word of God. And then he and I are going to have an argument about inerrancy and linguistic translation. And there is argument number 2 built into argument number 1. And
It's turtles all the way down.
it's turtles all the way down.
Yeah.
That is, you can always pick up, that the warrant doesn't hold, and you get an argument here before you can get to the argument here. Does anybody know what turtles all the way down means? You want to do it, Darla?
No, go for it. Go for
Okay.
it. That's all
In
you.
a famous book by Clifford Geertz, the American anthropologist, and I'm going to run out of time, he asks somebody in Bali
Is it? Yeah.
about it, because it's the same book with the Balinese
The
cockfighting. And he says, so tell me about your theory of the cosmos. What holds up the world? And the guy says, well, the world stands on the back of an elephant. He says, oh, okay. What holds up the elephant? He says, oh, the elephant stands on the back of a turtle. He said, okay. What holds up the turtle? He says, oh, after that, it's turtles all the way down. The turtle stands on the back of a turtle, it stands on the back of a turtle, it stands on the back of a turtle. It's turtles all the way down.
Yeah. So the Russian nesting doll effect, an argument you could.
One of the problems with an argument is at a
Feasibly.
certain point, you can never conclude an argument if you don't have something in common with the person
Right.
you're arguing with. You can always argue about the warrant. So, I can give you
Turtles
lots
to
of
turtles to
scientific
turtles.
examples, but it becomes turtles all the way down, warrants all the way down. They're always arguments nested in other arguments. So if my climate change denier doesn't accept the warrant of the greenhouse gas effect, I can either argue about that, or stage 2, can I find common ground? Is there something Josh and I are going to agree on as a place to begin that I can use as a warrant for connecting some kind of data to my claim? And this is, you can defend your warrant, but that takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and you're never going to get, at a certain point, to the claim you want to make. Or can you find a common ground, some assumption that you both believe in, that you can use as a warrant for a more direct argument? Am I making some? It's the reason argumentation can go on all night long. And I'm not telling you how to make somebody believe you. I'm just telling you, here's why arguments fail. Here's their structure. Here's where people disagree and why and what to do about it. And it's a function. The function of a warrant is to bridge the gap from data to claim. Data only supports claim if warrant bridges. That's the benefit of Toolman. You get the same terms that fit the same functions, roles, no matter what your argument is, and no matter what the field is.
You're writing how much bridging or warrants do you need to include?
Say again?
When you're writing to support your claim, the bridging or the warrants, you're saying how much, is there a certain amount that you should include, or just
Good question.
depends on the audience?
Good question, and I am going to, so this is the art, I'm answering your question. This is what I was just talking about. Both data and warrants often become claims in their own sub-arguments. They're nested. And often, really the most vicious argumentative conflicts are not about your claim, but about the hidden assumptions. Is the Bible a literal world of God or not? Does the greenhouse gas effect work? Or, you know, the warrants tend to be what people argue about. And if I can find the slide where I'm answering your question. Warrants. Warrants in argumentation are usually, in an argument that works, a warrant is a black box. You know what the metaphor of a black box is in technology? I can't hear you.
The black box on the thing?
No, I'm thinking of a black box. My computer is a black box. I don't know how it works. My car is a black box. I don't have to take it apart and understand all the pieces. It just works. When I turn a key, it goes. It's not something you examine, it just does something. My car bridges South Tampa to here, and I don't have to take it apart. In most arguments, your warrants, your background assumptions, if they're shared and not questioned, they're black boxes. When they work, they're invisible. The problem is when they don't work, when your warrants don't work, then they are invisible, then your argument fails. So, sort of, Toolman's question, Paula?
I was gonna say, so in its simplest form, arguments are syllogisms.
And or,
Yes.
oh, sorry, you were probably gonna say what I was about to say.
You go for it.
And or, oh, why am I blanking on the word? Yeah, E, starts with an E.
Enthymemes.
Enthymemes, and or enthymemes, which is just a syllogism with the middle part dropped out.
Okay, the problem is we're now talking technical logic, the difference between a syllogism and an enthymeme. And you're right. An argument is, in many ways, a syllogism. The warrant is the premise on which the claim is predicated. But we're now talking abstract theoretical logic, not that it's that complicated. And what Toolman and people like Obrecht Stateka and Chaim Perlman do is that don't use that language. It's too complicated. What you want to talk about is what is it that supports my claim and what bridges the difference between, they're trying to use more intuitive, everyday, ordinary language for thinking about argument. You're right, but if we're going to do that, it's going to take all semester to do symbolic logic. These guys have given us a very simple structure that says you move from data that supports to claim that you assert by having a warrant that kind of bridges or carries things, a qualification that hedges or limits. So yes, but this is a slightly different theory. You can map syllogism onto this. So to answer Andy's question, the more you have to, most of the time in an argument, you never mention the warrant. The warrant goes without saying because you share this assumption with somebody. If you have to articulate, defend, explain your warrant, then that suggests you're in a situation where you're not sure the people to whom you're speaking really see how the group, know what the greenhouse gas effect is. So when I'm talking to, I hate to say it, when I'm talking to undergraduates at USF, and I say, look, climate change really exists, here's the Keeling curve, and what connects that to this is the greenhouse gas effect. And when I say, do you all know what that is? About 3/4 of my undergraduates are gonna go, I never heard of that, man. So I have to explain it to them. So it depends on your audience. The problem is, the more you have to articulate and make explicit your warrants, the more difficulty you're going to be in. You're better off if you can make an argument where your listeners just nod their head and they intuitively see, oh, I see how that supports that. I see the connection without having to think about it. The more you move from, the more, I'm trying to think of a practical way of putting this, a yardstick. The more consequential your argument is, the bigger the consequences of it are, or the more contestable, the more contested, the more, I can't think of the nice adjective I want, contentious your argument is, the more you might then have to explain your warrant just in case. So.
I have an example.
Good.
The
Thank you.
recent MacArthur Genius winner, Ta-Nehisi Coates, wrote a big piece and became first a household name. Have you heard of this writer, Ta-Nehisi Coates? He writes mostly on race in the U.S., and he first made a name for himself in 2014 with a giant cover story in The Atlantic on reparations, which reparations in the U.S. is the idea that the historical legacy of slavery is so problematic that we need to have some sort of structural response that perhaps involves actually financially supporting people who have been affected by the historic, having ancestors who were affected negatively by slavery, right? Wow, that's a euphemistic way to put that. Having had ancestors who were slaves. And that's a really touchy subject in the U.S. Like, that's not a thing that politicians are talking about. That's not a popular position in mainstream media, I think. And so his piece was really long. It was, gosh, I don't know, it had to be like 15 or 20,000 words. In part because he had to work really hard to make the case, answering your question, Andy, that he was talking to an audience that he could assume did not share a lot of his assumptions about this particular issue and about the values he was trying to bring to it, versus the 5-paragraph op-ed in the Tampa Bay Times because somebody wants to sound off about whatever, and they can assume that a large number of the readers are going to agree with them, and so they might be able to make their point in 5 paragraphs.
One of the
So
reasons I'm asking it is because a lot of the time, so my understanding from this second assignment is going to be like we were saying, how do we do something, and people who are going to make those decisions are the ones writing to.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times they're politicians and policymakers who don't understand anything.
Right. So the trick there is to figure out what their values are and then write to those values. You don't have to start with your values. You start with their values and write to them.
And we will look at that when we look at, and I'm going to move fast from here on out so we can look at the 2 deliberative examples. In the example she just gave you, Ta-Nehisi Coates talking about reparation, the argument is that the American government should put in place policies that provide money to African American communities to make up for what happened before 1860. And the only thing that connects, here's what happened before 1860 to what you should do now is a warrant that is very contentious.
Yeah.
That is that there is a continuity, whether you believe this or not, this argument technically depends on this assumption that there is a continuity, that what happens to grandparents and great-grandparents gets handed down in a continuous form of oppression and
and
resource
policy, resource
deprivation, oppression, and policies and Jim Crow laws that connect what was happening then is still happening today.
Yeah.
I'm not making this argument for you, I'm just laying it out. The warrant here, Andy, is something that is Some people will accept, some people won't. If this is the argument you're making, you are going to have to back up and make this argument. This is the sub-argument that you're gonna have to make, because a lot of people won't, that's the warrant on which this exists, and most people who are gonna argue against this, we shouldn't do this, say, BS, then was then, now is now. And the argument would be, no, now is then and then is now. That is, what happened then still has effects generations later today.
And this is an article for a really, really broad readership versus the writing that we're asking you to do in the deliberative policy assignment. You can target much more narrowly. So this is everybody who reads The Atlantic or clicks on a link online versus what's an example of somebody you might write to for the deliberative policy assignment? Versus fuel manufacturing.
If you were writing about water management, you might be writing to SwiftMud,
Yes.
the Southwest Florida Water Management District.
Yes.
If you were writing
We
about.
did it! Thank you, Mary. We got a little golf clap. Yes. And so that you have a much clearer idea of what their values are. Like, you know what they are concerned with because you know that they're concerned with water quality, you know that they're concerned with meeting legal requirements for water quality, that you know that they're concerned with the financial aspects of things.
This is exactly what Nanette was talking about when she said, figure out who you're talking to. Oh, we're talking mostly to homeowners. Then they do some secret shopper stuff. They do some market research. What do homeowners care about? They care about having green lawns, but they really care about having their Saturdays off and going to the beach and having fun. And they hate the fact that they spend every Saturday out there in the yard. So you have an audience. You know what they care about. You can design their campaign or your policy argument to what are the values, what are the problems facing these people, what are their values, how do I speak to them using warrants they already accept. And
Lena
as
had a
Toolman says here,
Lena had a question too.
Lena, I'm sorry.
It would be helpful for our writing assignment to identify the warrants while writing the paper.
Often in your head,
Yeah.
this was sort of Andy's question. Relatively, we will look at it almost immediately. I'm going to move to warrants and the examples I gave you. The warrants in the policy piece aren't explicit, but they are there. You rarely say, my warrant for this argument is, but often you will say something like, in the policy piece, how fast can I make this thing click? Come on.
Not fast.
Not at all.
It's doing the thing. It's so annoying.
All right, it's got fresh batteries.
It's just, it might be because of the mouse. I don't know. I blame Microsoft. Microsoft's the worst.
I'm really in trouble here.
What?
The other professors usually.
Oh, put in there your own?
Yeah.
We should do that. All right, that's what we should do, Carl. Just start plugging in your laptop.
Yeah.
Smart.
Oh, okay. I will figure out how to get to your. Okay, so here's one. In policy statement 527, one of the very first things they do is they say, there are 50 different state regulations. And the claim they're trying to support here is that we should have we should adopt a national policy on e-waste recycling. They don't articulate this, but the warrant, if you know anything about policy, and if you know anything about industry, if there are 50 different policies in every state, the assumption, the warrant is that a regulatory environment has to be consistent and shouldn't cause unnecessary expense. And so when they don't say this, but they can assume that everybody who sets policy knows that you want to have policies that are efficient, they don't cause unnecessary expense, and I've been in any number of policy arguments, policy formation groups, and if you're trying to get to a national policy, the warrant is that if every state regulates something differently, you need a national policy because you're gonna have chaos. That regulatory environment has to be consistent. So I have a friend who's the world's leading expert on microelectromagnetic fields and their biological consequences. Can you get cancer from sleeping under an electric blanket? What happens to your body if you sleep under an electric blanket? And in policy argument, the argument is we need a national policy, because if you're an electric blanket manufacturer and you can sell it in Florida, but you have to sell a different blanket in Georgia and a different blanket in South Carolina and a different blanket in Alabama, if you have to make a different blanket for every state, you're out of business. You can't sell, and you and I can't, you don't need electric blankets here, but I used to live in Minnesota. Man, you need an electric blanket when it's 30 below. But to have an industry with 50 different state regulations, or think about car exhaust. You need a national EPA policy, not every state has a different. Am I making some sense? So they don't say this, but anybody who sets policy knows that if you've got a national issue, you have to have a consistent national policy. So that warrant, where they say, there are 50 different state policies on this, we need a national policy. The warrant that connects them goes without saying. Anybody who does policy, you need a consistent policy. You can't have automobiles regulated differently in every 50 states. Does that sort of get to your question? Okay. Somewhere.
It's the warrant is the part that if you're in the in crowd, like if you're in the target audience for that piece of writing, if you're a policymaker or someone with experience, the warrant is the thing that if it's actually written down, you'd be like, why did they bother writing that down? That's just obvious, right? So, I mean, you could think of any number of examples, like within a very religious context, writing down basic kind of religious principles as a way to justify specific rules, right? Like you don't even, it goes without saying in the Catholic Church that abstinence before marriage is, you know, that's, of course, that's like, wait, why would you even write that down to make your argument?
Yeah, so, you know, if you're making an argument that's fitted to your audience and the kind of argument, the genre and the argument field, your warrants go without saying. So if I say, I'm sorry, honey, we can't use birth control. The Pope said we shouldn't. The data is the Pope said we shouldn't. The claim is we shouldn't use birth control. The warrant, which goes unstated, is the Pope is infallible. If the Pope, actually, technically, the Pope is only infallible on certain questions of canon law. On questions of whether you can use birth control or not, he's not technically infallible, but he is the Pope, and we should do what El Papo says. I actually studied canon law when I was in
You're such
high
a
school.
nerd. I love it.
Yeah, a friend of mine was a Vatican-trained theologian. The Pope is only infallible on a certain, very narrow legal category of claims. That's actually not one of them. But the warrant would be, honey, the Pope says we shouldn't use birth control, so we can't use condoms. You know, is because the Pope said so. And in a particular kind of conservative Catholic community and family, you don't have to say any more.
Yeah.
My wife, my mother grew up in a conservative Catholic community where having 17 or 20 kids was not uncommon.
Mary, did you want to throw something in?
No, it doesn't really matter. I was just, what I thought she said, or what made sense to me to be helpful, is that if we're making an argument and we're writing this paper, that writing down the warrants might help write the paper. Not that they actually go in the paper, but,
Right.
Yeah.
but for outlining your paper.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Being
a great idea.
clear.
I thought that's maybe what you were asking.
Yes.
Yeah,
For you,
thank you.
writing
Oh,
down the
yeah.
warrants to see, and is this a warrant that this group of people would accept? My argument depends on this assumption. Do they accept this? If they do, you're good. If do they accept this? No, then you're in trouble. Okay.
Your argument would work when I read it about Catholic girls.
Wait, what? I didn't hear that.
Okay.
My wife's a Methodist.
Not
Was
Catholic.
Methodist. So I want to move quickly because I don't have much time. He talks about qualifiers. So you can qualify your claim. So we can say it is highly likely that climate change is caused by human activity. You know, this is what the IPC says. You qualify your claim. How strongly do you know that this evidence supports it? And then there's the notion of a rebuttal, and I'll give you my example. The rebuttal says, under what circumstances does your evidence not fit your claim, not support your claim? So here's my climate change argument. The atmosphere concentrations of CO2 are increasing steadily. That's my data. That's the Keeling curve. And since that increases the greenhouse gas effect, my warrant, anthropogenic climate change, my claim, climate change is real, it's caused by people, it's anthropogenic. Qualification is almost certainly happening unless the source of CO2 is a natural process rather than human activity. And there are lots of climate change skeptics who are going to say it's not caused by humans. So you could say, same argument gets more complicated. In one sentence, atmospheric concentrations of CO2 are increasing steadily, data. And since that increases the greenhouse gas effect, warrant, anthropogenic climate change, my claim, is almost certainly happening. I'm qualifying it because we're not absolutely certain. Unless the source of CO2 is a natural process rather than human activity, so it comes from methane from cows, or it comes from swamps, or it's the source of increased heat is the natural cycle of the sun's radiation. You may or may not know that one of the denialist argument is that the sun has high radiation cycles and low radiation cycles, and that counts for it. And it's not true, by the way. So if you're doing that and you're a scientist, you have nested arguments. You have to deal with those rebuttals. Rebuttal 1, the average temperature rise in the atmosphere coincides precisely, I'll show you the graphs, with the increase of CO2 starting in the Industrial Revolution. Rebuttal 2, there is a relatively small change in solar radiation caused by solar cycles, but it can only account for about 4% of the heat change. If you take all of it and then you look at all of the change in climate, it can only account for about 4%. That's not it. My point is, arguments nested in arguments. They can give you a rebuttal, and you're gonna either just move on or you're gonna have to back up and give them evidence to explain why their rebuttal doesn't hold. And it can go on all night. So, I'm moving at some speed. I wanna look at our examples. We've talked about all this. Okay, so here's your first example, the piece on policy statement. The forensic piece was talking to scientists. Here are your pieces, policymakers. For the scientists, they were asking a technical problem. They have a technical problem, 82%. What's the percentage of waste that's discarded? That's what that proved. They were arguing about matters of fact. They were answering a question, how much waste is there? When you accommodate this information to a group of policymakers, you move from a technical problem, how much is there, to a regulatory problem. Oops, with state-by-state regulation, we have a problem. It's inefficient. Instead of answering a question of a matter of fact, the policy piece is answering a question, what should we be doing? They start with a claim. Legislation should be consistent with the principles of product stewardship, should target all of the electronic wastes for recycling and reuse in an environmentally safe and economic manner. Their argument, if you've read that little piece, it's very schematic, it's very clear, says, here's a claim. Then they give you some data. We've done this. There are 50 states, we need a national policy, warrant, we have to have an environment that's consistent. They give you some more. Europe and Asian countries have already done this. We should be adopting a national policy. The warrant, what works there will work here. It's practical. You could ask a rebuttal. Yeah, but the social and economic systems in Asia and Europe are very different than in America. Just because it worked there doesn't mean it would work here. Now you've got to back up and explain that really it will work. Those economies aren't that different. You know, every argument, every claim, every warrant has its weak chinks. You're making an appeal here to practical wisdom. It worked there, it'll work here, it's practical. In the one before, you know, too many regulations, we need a national policy. You're making an appeal to efficiency and self-preservation. Those are the appeals that policy arguments tend to make. They give you an argument that product stewardship will save money and reduce pollution. We should have a national policy. Why? Because efficiency is a good thing and pollution is a problem. You're appealing to efficiency and to a notion of caution. Don't have more pollution than you need. It's a very straightforward and simple argument. Notice that in a deliberative argument, as opposed to that epideictic one, the language is very reserved. There are no individual actions. There are no emotional appeals. There's not a narrative. When you shift from the genre of epideictic to deliberative, you know, your language, your appeals, the format changes. There are very few details in here, unlike the forensic piece, because they're speaking with the authority of all of the American civil engineers. They don't have to give you details. You literally are saying, being asked to take their word for it because it's being put out by 5,000 civil engineers. Trust me, is what they're saying. Quickly, the goodwill paper. Similarly, you're moving from forensic to deliberative, from scientists to a rhetorical ecology that's very dispersed. Lots of different agencies, lots of different offices, lots of different people. Instead of a technical problem about how much waste is there, they're talking about organizational problems. It's goodwill, so they do talk about humanitarian suffering, a problem they want to reduce. But the biggest reframing, the problem goodwill cares about mostly is they have the burden, the cost of this donated e-waste. That is, the problem that the organization cares about is the problem that your policy needs to solve for them. Does this make some sense? Okay. And I am almost done. They have data. It's a lot more diffuse. One of the reasons we gave you this white paper is because we were trying to suggest that policy arguments, deliberative rhetoric, can take lots of different forms. The first little statement is very schematic, very short. This one is long and diffuse because it's a different organization. It's speaking in a different rhetorical ecology. A white paper is a different genre than a policy statement. But it still has data. The data about Reconnect, saving money, about the local agency profiles that work and successfully manage the burden are data. The warrant, what works at Reconnect and at local agencies can work other places in goodwill, leads to their claim. You know, goodwill should, and then they've given you all these recommendations at the local, state, national level, and all of them are ban this, require this, implement this, things you should do. It's appealing to the same things: efficiency, self-preservation, practicality. It works, it saves money, it'll keep us from going out of business because we've got all this e-waste we don't know anything to do about. That is, the nomenclature fits both arguments because they're both doing, in different ways, they're performing the same functions. They're providing data to support a claim connected by a warrant. They can qualify and deal with rebuttals, but it's the what they're doing that stays the same, not the content, the functions you do to make an argument. No matter what kind of argument, stay the same. Okay, I think, so when you're making your deliberative accommodation, you need to state a claim, and that is, you're stating a policy. We should do, and then state your policy. You need to offer evidence or good reasons, but those good reasons and evidence have to fit that argument field. It has to appeal to readers' shared values and warrants that they won't question. You have to form your policy in a way that speaks to an agency, a problem that your readers will recognize as a problem for them, not for you. So for goodwill, the problem is we've got all this stuff we can't get rid of that people dump. We got to solve this problem. Oh, to solve that problem, we need these policies. And you need to follow the expectations and constraints of the genre. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah.
You want to talk about the
Sure.
assignment?
Yeah.
You told me to leave 15 minutes. I left 3.
Perfect. No, we go to 8:45.
Oh, I left
Yeah, no,
17 minutes.
You're done early. You're done early. Just to kind of follow up on what Carl just left off on, this idea of you have to identify the thing that you're writing policy towards as their problem, not your problem. A heads up, that's something that we've seen people struggle with in the past with this assignment, where it becomes about, I think this is a problem because I have moral objections, or I am committed to environmentalism or sustainability or whatever, and that doesn't work, right? If you think about making you should arguments, any you should argument, you know, ultimately relies on the other person to agree that it's a problem for them. Even if it's as simple as Carl telling Francis, his daughter, you should clean your room, ultimately he's making it her problem by threatening to take away her electronics if she doesn't.
Actually, I tell her, if you keep leaving that stuff on the floor, you're gonna get ants and cockroaches in your room.
Yeah.
And you're gonna hate that, baby.
Yeah.
And so her problem is she's terrified of ants and cockroaches.
Right.
And if she keeps leaving popcorn bowls and popsicle sticks, she's gonna get them.
Versus my nephew, who that would not work on because he doesn't think that's a problem.
Ew.
Yeah.
Well, when we were writing, can you give some examples of policy makers? Who are we gonna?
Yeah.
Can it be like a company or something like that?
Okay.
Has to be legislation.
Yes, so,
Yes.
you know, you could, in one of the in one of the earlier pieces, one of our students proposed to a local craft beer manufacturer that they should adopt certain kinds of policies about sustainability, and took the notions from the JL piece about closed loop and life cycle and the 6 R's, and use those to explain why it would be good if this brewery adopted a policy that they only did X, they should do Y. You could, if I were trying to think of an example, I'm trying to think of an example of, you know, the water, the systems analysis and water piece. That's one of the ones we gave you. Swift Mud, or the city of Tampa, or probably, you know, you might write to the people who own and run, what's that, the Villages in Central. You know what the Villages is? It's this largest retirement community, old farts and golf courts who all vote Republican. You know, you could write to them and say, you should adopt a policy X to do Y about your water management here, and part of your evidence would be the ideas, concepts from that article on systems analysis and water management. So the technical concepts that you pick up out of those forensic pieces are really going to be the data, the evidence that you use to support a policy claim. And the policy, and you're making an argument. You're saying, you should do X. So you got to know who that you is, the Villages. What should they do? You should manage your water in a particular kind of way. Why should I do it? Why should I do that, man? Then give me an argument. What's your evidence? What are the warrants that connect that evidence to you should do this? So one of the things she's going to do in just a second is say, the same way with the epidictic piece, you had to find a case, an example. Here, you have to find somebody that you are speaking to. And the more specific and particular and real, the better off you're going to be. And your policy claim is just, you know, for the following good reasons, you should do X. That's what this comes down
For
to.
the following good reasons that you care about.
For the following good reasons, you have a problem that you care about. And for these good reasons that you're willing to accept as good, you can solve your problem by adopting this policy. The you attitude.
So I can't like write to Rick Scott and tell him he's dumb and then actually send it to him?
No. Well, you absolutely can.
I'm being videotaped, so I can't say what I'm going to say. That isn't going to work.
Yeah. No, you're welcome to do that. Just don't turn it in for this assignment.
Yeah, don't connect it with my name.
Yeah. Pedro.
It doesn't have to be linked with the first one.
Nope, not
No.
at all. Not at all. This is a totally separate deliverable, all part of the same project. Because if you think about it, so this is the name of this project, right? We did the epidictic. You're doing the deliberative. The name of the project is the accommodation project. So accommodation is just the process of taking technical information and then making it A, accessible to people who don't have a lot of technical knowledge necessarily, but then B, suiting it to a particular rhetorical situation with a particular audience, particular purpose, etc. So it's kind of like a two-step process. You've taken your article, so let's say you're doing the sustainable manufacturing article. You've taken that, you've read it really carefully, you've figured out what the technical concepts are, and you figured out, okay, here's how I can talk about this in more accessible language. That's step one. Step two then is, okay, how do I make it fit this rhetorical situation and purpose? In the case of the epidictic, that rhetorical situation was, okay, I have a generalized audience. I want to write something that they're going to find entertaining, that's going to engage them, perhaps inspire them. They don't necessarily need to take a lot of technical information away from this piece. That's that rhetorical situation. Step one, accommodate. Step two, suit to the rhetorical situation. For this one, deliberative, you've already done that first step. You did that, when you were working on the epidictic, where you read your technical piece really carefully and figured out what the main concepts were. So all we're asking you to do is step two, which is to say, okay, I'm going to pick a rhetorical situation. I'm picking an audience. I'm picking the people I'm talking to, and then I'm going to write a piece that's geared towards that rhetorical situation. Does that make sense?
So what she said is, you start with technical information. First thing you do is you read it. What's the core of it? What are the core concepts? What are the main ideas? How do I make that accessible to people who don't understand physics? And then how do I accommodate that to the purpose I have in an audience? You have a different purpose and audience with epidictic, and it takes a different form. Same ideas, but it takes a different form than a deliberative one. So these core concepts are going to figure in the deliberative probably as data. Maybe some of them might work as warrants. But your job is to find an organization, because organizations set policy, that has a problem associated with water, systems analysis, manufacturing, and tell them, based on this information, you should do this. Andy.
Oh,
It's okay
Sorry.
to write this in like the second person.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's the way to go, yes. Paula.
Two questions. The first one is, I'm not sure how you're supposed to do this in one sentence, because if you have a strong enough argument, then you could possibly just convince them that way.
Mhm.
Are you supposed to expand upon whether or not if they don't agree with your warrant?
Oh, like include the rebuttal? Is that what you're asking? Judgment call, I think.
There are, if there are going to be, if you know that there are common objections and rebuttals to what you're arguing, that it's good, Cicero, the Roman rhetorician, called it a refutatio, to refute the counter-argument as part of your argument. So when you hear somebody talk about climate change, they'll say, look, here's the argument about climate change, and for those of you who are going to tell me that this is about Earth tilting on its axis or cycles of stronger and lesser sun radiation, here's the data on that. That contributes a teeny little bit, but those two things together only contribute about 5% of it. So that's not part of it. So if you know from history, climate change arguments are like this, that people are going to say that because those are the urban legends about climate change, then you can rebut them as you go as part of your argument. But it's situational.
And sorry, go ahead.
Do you have to account for that?
When you say do you have to account for that, are you asking like when we grade the piece?
Exactly.
Oh, no.
Okay.
By no means will we be sort of like checklisting, like, oh, they didn't rebut it's situational. So as long as you do the work of accommodating the primary technical information and making sure you hit the main core concepts that are relevant. So like for the sustainable manufacturing argument, that means you got to talk about the 6 R's. That means you have to talk about life cycle analysis. That means you have to talk about closed loop systems. Those are the 3 concepts. And so as long as you do that, and then also find ways to argue to make it your audience's problem, right? And to convince them that it's worth their time and energy to solve this problem, then that's all we're asking for. If you do a rebuttal because it makes sense situationally, that can only strengthen your case, but we're not going to like dock it if you don't address every possible counter argument. Again, I mean, you read that really short civil engineers piece, and again, apologies, I left it off the schedule, that's on me. That really short civil engineers piece, they don't really do anything like that. It's still a really effective policy claim. Same.
So, give me 1 second. I'm going to translate what she just said. If you were doing the first accommodation, a third of your job really was reading it, what are the core concepts? A third of your job was, can you make those things accessible to non-experts? A third of your job was, can you build a case that you can tell a story with characters and narrative? Here, same thing. What are the core concepts? Can you make the language accessible? And in deliberative, can you articulate a policy? Can you make an argument that has a claim, that has data, that has warrants?
And a rebuttal is bonus.
And
If it
possibly,
seems relevant.
I guess the rebuttal goes there.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Okay.
Awesome. Sam?
Oh, I'm concerned because the article I chose and that I kind of want to still focus on.
Yeah, definitely. I would recommend stick with the same one.
Yeah.
Yeah, why double your work?
Yeah. The problem is it's about systems thinking. I didn't
Yes.
think of it as technical. I mean, it's technical, but it's not technological. So I don't really know how to go about talking to a policymaker about that part.
Yeah. With that one, I would recommend, and I say this, so I'm grading those from the epidictic. I think the focus should be as much on the sustainable development part, because it's system thinking for sustainable development, right? Like the two going hand in hand. So it's not technical, certainly in the sense that like the 6 R's and let's talk about lots of chemicals and all of that. It's certainly not that. But it is absolutely an abstract technical concept that could be applied to a business or to an NGO or to a government policy, right? It's a way of thinking about how to do things, and that's what policy is. Policy tells us how to do things. And so what you would be recommending then is you should be applying this to the way that you do X, and X, fill in the blank depending on the audience. Does that help?
Yeah.
Do you think?
I
Okay.
could give like specific examples of like use this model or something
Mm-hmm.
of
Yes.
systems thinking.
Yes, exactly. And so you in that case, the challenge is a little bit different, but in that case, let's say for example, going back to SwiftMud, which is an obvious fit for the water article, you could instead take this systems thinking and write to them and say, hey, you have a problem where, I don't know what problem SwiftMud has, I probably shouldn't have chosen this as an example, but you have a problem that you are losing, X amount of stormwater runoff that could be reclaimed for surface water drinking treatment, right? And a systems thinking approach would allow you to evaluate the entire water life cycle in order to avoid that stormwater. I totally made all that up. I have no idea if any of that
All right,
is
I'll give you a
truly
quicker
relevant.
one with water.
Okay.
You may or may not know, and this one's probably too big, but you may or may not know that, bless them, our legislature just decided to devote $200 million a year to Everglades restoration.
Yes.
Believe it? Amendment 1 money,
Yeah, that was the
Just,
amendment that we voted on, what, year before
a
last?
couple of years ago, clear out of the blue. But, and this is all hypothetical. I'm more interested that you learn how an argument is structured, what the difference between forensic, deliberative, and epidictic rhetoric is, so that at some point when you're working somewhere and my friend Josh is writing to his boss Jason at Greenwise and says, Greenwise should adopt X policy because I know some stuff from being in the College of Sustainability and we ought to do X about what we do at the store. But you could say, hypothetically, you're writing to the commission in charge of Everglades restoration, and because you can think of systems analysis and water management, there are certain general policies that they should adopt to guide how they spend that $200 million a year. I guarantee you that there are people making about $200,000 a year salary who are doing exactly that right now.
Consulting. Yeah.
Consultants who are telling the legislature and SwiftMud, you should adopt the following kinds of policies to manage and spend that money. You should spend that money in these ways because this is what you want, and here's the data that will get you there.
Yeah.
Paul?
That is quick.
And-
Okay,
Well,
Andy?
and also I want to break in at some point because we haven't actually
I'm done.
looked at the assignment sheet, and I wonder if looking at the assignment sheet might not answer some of these questions in advance.
And we
So I'm going to ask
have
folks
very
to
few minutes.
hold.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask
Hold
folks
your
to
question, you can
hold.
ask us after class. Let her look
If
at the
we need
assignment
to.
sheet.
But I just want to point this out. So one thing really quickly, somebody very nicely pointed out to us that this says 3 to 5 pages on the assignment sheet and it says 2 to 4 on the syllabus. It's because we changed it to be consistent. It used to be 2 to 4 last semester. We changed it on this assignment sheet to be consistent with the epidictic. I should have talked to you about this before class, Carl, but I'm going to make a controversial potentially statement, which is I don't care. 2 to 5. Let's call it 2 to 5. Whatever it takes to get the work done, right? Whatever length you need. So if you go with the syllabus, it's 2 to 4. If you go with this, it's 3 to 5. I don't care. Okay. All right. So just like with the epidictic, we've given you a couple of steps to help you follow and work your way through this. First, as is probably clear, you've already done the work of figuring out what the core technical concepts are. So in order to write to a rhetorical situation, the very first thing you have to do is determine what organization or group you're writing to. Right? So are you writing to the Florida legislature about watershed Everglade restoration? Are you writing to a business? Yeah, I don't know. You have to figure that out.
The more specific and absolutely realistic you pick an audience, an organization, the better off you are. The vaguer it is, the harder you're going to have making decisions, and the harder for us to evaluate whether you did it well.
That's 100% true.
Specificity, particularity, reality.
And then we ask you to conduct primary or secondary research to determine what the existing problems and policies are. This should not be as heavy a burden as doing the research to find case information for the epidictic. Really all we're asking is this is the work that you can do to make sure that you are going to be able to make it a problem for them. Does that make sense? Like, you need to research that organization a little bit to make sure that A, they're not already doing the thing you're going to tell them to do, right? Yes or no. And B, do they in fact care enough about efficiency or about profit or about whatever that I can make this thing a problem for them? That
Nobody
I can show
does
them how it's a
anything
problem.
or adopts a policy unless they have a problem that they need solving. It has to be their problem, not yours.
Yeah. Consider arguments and appeals that are appropriate to your audience. So this is just a fancy way of saying, figure out what the things are that they care about that you can make claims about, right?
And what warrants they will accept.
And this might be Lena's question, right? So this might be the stage in the process where you write down the warrants. Like, okay, these are the things I know they value. And the things you write down might not make it into the final paper, but they help you think of claims. They help you think of arguments.
I don't always
which I think
write
is what
those
you're asking
down,
about.
but I think about them.
They're always in my head.
Back when I was deaning and I was writing administrative policy proposals, I was always thinking, what does my friend Dwayne Smith, the senior vice provost, what's this problem look like from Dwayne's point of view? And why does Dwayne care? And what can I say that Dwayne values that I can get Dwayne to see if he does what I'm telling him to do, he'll get what he wants and solve his problem.
I like how many
And
times you said
I have
that.
those in my head because I know Dwayne, who's a great guy, by the way. But you might want to, it's not a bad idea to write them down just so you're clear.
And then finally, write it up. And as Carl mentioned, we gave you two very different looking pieces, the very short piece from the civil engineers and the very long piece from Goodwill, just to give you a sense of how varied these policy deliberative recommendations can be. They can, in fact, half my dissertation is about one policy recommendation document that's 111 individual policy recommendations spread across 88 pages. Like, that they can look very, very different. They can span the gamut. And so you should feel free to take a little creative license in terms of how you actually organize it. If you want to use subtitles, use some subtitles. If you want to use bullet points, use some bullet points. If you want to add a picture, add a picture. But just keep in mind that the goal is the content. The goal is the argument. If your argument's strong and you've made good organizational choices, it's not like we're asking you to make it look like one of the two things we gave you
Are
necessarily.
you making a clear claim, stating a policy? Are you providing ample evidence for why they should do that? Is your evidence connected to the claim with warrants and good reasons to a problem that they will accept and care about?
So this is due next Thursday. You have a week. So you've already, hopefully, again, having done this work already, that was half the battle. So now you just got to figure out your audience and start writing to that. We are always available to you on email to talk about if you have questions or problems.
Not always, not between midnight and 7
that's
a.m.
true. But invariably one of us is available. I know you have another question, Paula, but it is late. So ask the question. The rest of y'all, if you want to start packing up,
Yeah,
please
it's
feel free.
8:48.
I was just wondering, do we have to provide a solution? Because I know policy is a suggestion, and we have to provide a solution.
I'm not sure I
One way
understand.
of yes and no.
Okay.
Not all problems, first answer, not all problems can be solved. But at a certain point, the policy you're telling them to adopt, you should do this, has to either solve or at least minimize their problem. Your policy is a response to a problem that makes the problem better.
We don't have to describe the